On the 7th of June, 1844, a single-edition newspaper rolled off a small press in Nauvoo, Illinois. It was called the Nauvoo Expositor, and it contained sworn affidavits from men and women who had once stood at the very center of the Mormon leadership. They named names, they provided dates, they described secret ceremonies, secret marriages, and a secret theology that the prophet Joseph Smith had been teaching behind closed doors while publicly denying all of it. The newspaper had one edition, just one, because 3 days later, Joseph Smith, acting as both the prophet of the church and the mayor of Nauvoo, ordered the printing press physically destroyed. 100 men from the Nauvoo Legion marched to the building, dragged the press into the street, smashed the type, and burned every copy they could find. Within 3 weeks, Joseph Smith was dead, shot by a mob at Carthage jail, and the church he had built would spend the next 180 years trying to make sure that the story of that newspaper never became the story of Mormonism itself. But here is what the official manuals never told you. The destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor was not an act of desperation by a man under siege. It was the logical conclusion of a strategy that had been in place since the very first day of the church. From the moment the Book of Mormon came off the press in 1830, Joseph Smith understood that whoever controlled the printing press controlled the narrative. And for 14 years he controlled it brilliantly. He used the press to build a religion, to recruit tens of thousands of converts, to establish cities, and to project an image of divine authority that few dared to question publicly. The Expositor was the first time the press turned against him from the inside, and his response revealed something that every former member sitting in this audience has felt in their own life. When the institution cannot control the message, it destroys the messenger. This is not simply the story of a newspaper. This is the story of how the pattern began. Section 1. The press as a weapon of faith. To understand what happened in Nauvoo in 1844, you have to go back 14 years to a print shop on Main Street in Palmyra, New York. The shop belonged to Egbert Bratt Grandin, a 23-year-old printer who ran the local Wayne Sentinel. In the summer of 1829, Joseph Smith approached Grandin with a manuscript he claimed had been translated from ancient golden plates through the power of God. Grandin refused. The manuscript was enormous, the claims were bizarre, and the people of Palmyra already regarded the Smith family with deep suspicion. Joseph's father had a reputation as a treasure digger, and the son's stories about angelic visitors and buried plates had made the family a subject of local ridicule. But Joseph Smith had something more persuasive than revelation. He had money. Martin Harris, a successful farmer in Palmyra and one of Smith's earliest converts, agreed to mortgage 150 acres of his own farm to guarantee the printing costs of $3,000. That was an extraordinary sum in 1829, roughly equivalent to $100,000 today, and it tells you something critical about the economics of early Mormonism. The church did not begin with prayer. It began with a financial transaction. Harris put his land on the line, Grandin accepted the guarantee, and by March of 1830, 5,000 copies of the Book of Mormon were stacked in the back of the print shop, ready for distribution. What happened next was, by the standards of the era, a remarkably sophisticated product launch. Paid advertisements appeared in the Wayne Sentinel and other regional newspapers announcing that the Book of Mormon was available for sale. The ads were simple and commercial, almost identical in tone to advertisements for farm equipment or legal notices. There was no fire from heaven in the marketing copy, just a book, a price, and a location. And that restraint was deliberate. Smith understood, perhaps instinctively, that legitimacy came from treating the Book of Mormon not as a curiosity, but as a product with the same right to shelf space as any other volume. The press gave it that legitimacy, but printed advertisements could only reach people who already read newspapers. For the rest, Smith needed feet on the ground, and he found them almost immediately. Within weeks of the church's formal organization in April of 1830, missionaries were carrying copies of the Book of Mormon westward. Samuel Smith, Joseph's younger brother, spent the summer walking from village to village with a knapsack full of books, leaving copies at inns, with ministers, with anyone who would take one. He was not a trained evangelist. He was a farmer's son with a bag of books and a conviction that the contents would do the persuading for him. And in at least one extraordinary case, he was right. A copy that Samuel left at a roadside inn eventually reached Brigham Young, who would go on to lead the church for 3 decades after Joseph's death. The most effective of these early missionaries was Parley Parker Pratt, a former Campbellite preacher who had converted after reading the Book of Mormon in August of 1830. Pratt was charismatic, tireless, and deeply literate, and he combined personal preaching with the physical distribution of printed material in a way that no other American religious movement had attempted at that scale. He traveled to Ohio and converted Sidney Rigdon, a prominent Campbellite minister whose entire congregation of over 100 people followed him into Mormonism almost overnight. Pratt then continued westward to Missouri, preaching to Native American communities along the way and leaving copies of the Book of Mormon at every stop. What Pratt and the other early missionaries were doing was not simply evangelism, it was a distribution network. The Book of Mormon was both the message and the medium. Every copy placed in someone's hands was a self-contained argument for the church's truth claims, and the missionaries who carried them served as the living endorsement. The strategy worked with stunning efficiency. By 1831, barely a year after the church's founding, membership had grown from 6 people in a farmhouse to over 1,000, spread across New York, Ohio, and Missouri. The printing press had given Mormonism its scripture, its credibility, and its first converts. And Joseph Smith was paying very close attention to what that meant. By 1832, Smith had launched the church's own newspaper, the Evening and the Morning Star, published in Independence, Missouri, under the editorship of William Wynne Phelps. This was a critical evolution. The church was no longer relying on outside printers or paid advertisements in secular papers. It now controlled its own press, its own editorial voice, and its own narrative. The content of the Evening and the Morning Star was a careful blend of doctrinal instruction, community news, and reprints of Joseph Smith's revelations, presented as the direct word of God. There was no editorial separation between news and scripture. The paper treated both as equally authoritative, and for readers who had already accepted Smith's prophetic claims, that blending was seamless. The press was no longer just a marketing tool. It had become an instrument of institutional authority. Over the next decade, as the church grew and relocated from Ohio to Missouri to Illinois, the pattern deepened. Smith launched additional publications, the Latter-day Saints Messenger and Advocate, the Elders' Journal, and eventually the Times and Seasons in Nauvoo. Each of these served the same dual function. They promoted the church to the outside world while simultaneously reinforcing internal loyalty among the membership. Dissent, when it appeared, was addressed not through open debate, but through editorial control. Critics were dismissed as apostates, persecutors, or agents of Satan. The press told the membership who to trust, what to believe, and how to interpret the growing hostility of their neighbors. And because most members had no access to outside sources of information, the church's publications were, for all practical purposes, their only window onto the world. By 1843, the church had perfected a media ecosystem that would be recognizable to any modern communications strategist. It had owned publications, a controlled editorial voice, a network of missionaries who served as both recruiters and information gatekeepers, and a leadership structure that treated unauthorized speech as a form of betrayal. Nauvoo, The city Smith had built on the banks of the Mississippi was home to nearly 12,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in Illinois. Smith was simultaneously the prophet, the mayor, the lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion, and the chief editor of the narrative. Everything the membership knew about the church came through channels that Joseph Smith either owned or directly supervised. And that is precisely why the Nauvoo Expositor was so dangerous. Not because it told lies, but because it told the truth from inside the walls. Section 2. The people who broke ranks. William Law had been as close to Joseph Smith as any man alive. Born in Northern Ireland in 1809, Law had converted to Mormonism in Canada and risen rapidly through the leadership. By 1841, he had been called to serve as second counselor in the First Presidency, the highest governing body of the church. He sat beside Joseph Smith in council meetings. He knew the private teachings, he knew the financial dealings, and by 1843 he knew things that Smith had explicitly ordered him to keep secret. The central issue was plural marriage. Joseph Smith had been practicing polygamy in secret since at least 1833, and by 1843 he had taken dozens of plural wives. The historical record, painstakingly assembled from affidavits, diaries, and later court testimony, documents approximately 48 women who were sealed to Smith during his lifetime. 11 of those women were already legally married to other men. Several were teenagers, including Helen Mar Kimball, who was 14 years old when Smith proposed a sealing to her in 1843, telling her family that the union would ensure their eternal salvation. None of this was public. Smith had been denying the practice of polygamy in print since the early 1830s, and the official church newspaper, The Times and Seasons, had published explicit denials as recently as 1842. The membership was told, repeatedly and in writing, that the church practiced only traditional monogamous marriage. But within the inner circle, the reality was entirely different. Smith was actively recruiting plural wives, sending trusted associates to approach women and their families, and performing secret sealing ceremonies that were unknown to the general membership. William Law learned the full scope of the practice when Smith approached Jane Law, William's wife, with a proposal for a plural marriage. The details of that encounter remain contested by historians, but the result is not. William Law was horrified. He confronted Smith privately and was rebuffed. He raised the issue in First Presidency meetings and was told that plural marriage was a divine commandment, a restoration of the practices of Abraham and Jacob, and that any man who rejected it was placing his own salvation in jeopardy. Law refused to accept this, and in January of 1844 he was excommunicated. But Law was not alone. Austin Cowles, a member of the Nauvoo High Council who had seen the secret revelation on plural marriage, now known as Doctrine and Covenants, Section 132, had also broken with Smith over the issue. Francis M. Higbee and Chauncey Higbee, two brothers with legal training and their own grievances against the church leadership, joined the dissenters. So did several other former members and church leaders who had reached the same conclusion. The prophet they had followed was not simply practicing polygamy. He was lying about it systematically, using the church's own press to deny what he was doing in private and excommunicating anyone who challenged him. These were not peripheral figures. They were men and women who had served in the leadership, who had sacrificed for the church, who had built Nauvoo with their own hands, and they decided to do the one thing that Joseph Smith had never allowed anyone inside the church to do. They decided to start their own newspaper. The group formed the Nauvoo Expositor Publishing Company, purchased a printing press, and on the 7th of June, 1844, published the first and only edition of the Nauvoo Expositor. The paper was 16 pages of carefully structured accusations, supported by sworn affidavits and signed testimonies. It was not a gossip sheet. It was a legal document disguised as a newspaper, and its contents were devastating. The Expositor's lead article laid out the case against Smith in measured but unflinching language. It accused him of teaching and practicing plural marriage in secret while publicly denying it. It named specific women. It described the methods Smith used to recruit wives, including the claim of divine commandment and the promise of exaltation. It detailed the King Follett sermon, delivered just weeks earlier in April of 1844, in which Smith had publicly taught that God was once a man and that human beings could become gods themselves, a doctrine that was radically at odds with the Christianity that most members believed they had joined. The affidavits were signed under oath by people who had been in the room when these teachings were given and these marriages were performed. For the first time in 14 years, the printing press was telling a story that Joseph Smith had not authorized, and the story was coming from people who could not be dismissed as ignorant outsiders or anti-Mormon agitators. They were insiders. They had the names, the dates, and the receipts. Section 3, the destruction. Joseph Smith's response was immediate, and it followed a logic that had been embedded in the church's governance structure since Nauvoo's founding. Smith was not only the prophet, he was the mayor, and Nauvoo operated under a city charter granted by the Illinois state legislature in 1840 that gave the city council extraordinary powers of self-governance. Smith convened the Nauvoo City Council on the 8th of June, one day after the Expositor's publication, and the council debated the newspaper for hours. The arguments made in that council session are preserved in contemporary records, and they are revealing. Smith and his allies did not argue that the Expositor's claims were false. They argued that the newspaper was a public nuisance, a threat to the peace and safety of Nauvoo, and that the city council had the legal authority to abate it. Hiram Smith, Joseph's brother and the assistant president of the church, argued forcefully for destruction. The council voted unanimously to declare the Expositor a nuisance and to order its removal. On the 10th of June, City Marshal John P. Green, accompanied by a force estimated at 100 men drawn from the Nauvoo Legion, marched to the Expositor's printing office. They entered the building, carried the press into the street, smashed it with sledgehammers, scattered the type, and burned the remaining copies of the newspaper. The entire operation took less than an hour. By nightfall, the Nauvoo Expositor had been physically erased. The legal and political consequences were catastrophic and swift. William Law and the other publishers filed charges against Smith in Hancock County Court. The destruction of a printing press was not simply a property crime. It was an attack on the freedom of the press, a principle so deeply embedded in American constitutional law that even Smith's allies in the Illinois legislature could not defend it. Non-Mormon communities surrounding Nauvoo, already hostile to the growing power of the Mormon settlement, seized on the incident as proof that Smith was a tyrant operating outside the law. Thomas Sharp, editor of the Warsaw Signal and one of the most vocal anti-Mormon voices in the region, called openly for Smith's arrest and removal. Governor Thomas Ford of Illinois intervened, demanding that Smith submit to arrest and trial in Carthage, the county seat. Smith initially resisted, then briefly fled across the Mississippi into Iowa before being persuaded to return. On the 25th of June, Joseph and Hiram Smith surrendered to authorities in Carthage and were jailed on charges of inciting a riot. 2 days later, on the 27th of June, a mob of approximately 150 men with blackened faces stormed the jail. Hiram was shot and killed almost immediately. Joseph ran to the window and was shot multiple times, falling from the second story to the ground below. He was dead at the age of 38. The destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor did not save Joseph Smith. It killed him. The very act of silencing the press created the political and legal crisis that led directly to his arrest, his imprisonment, and his murder. The information he had tried to suppress, the polygamy, the secret theology, the financial entanglements, all of it eventually became part of the public record anyway. But the lesson that the church's surviving leadership took from the episode was not that suppression was wrong. The lesson they took was that suppression had to be more effective. Section 4. The pattern that never stopped Brigham Young, who assumed leadership of the majority of the church after Smith's death, was a more disciplined operator than his predecessor in almost every respect, and nowhere more so than in the management of information. Young understood that Smith's mistake with the expositor was not the impulse to suppress, it was the clumsiness of the method. Smashing a printing press in the street was dramatic, visible, and legally indefensible. The better strategy was to ensure that dissenting voices never reached the press in the first place. Under Young's leadership, the church tightened its control over internal communication to a degree that Smith had never achieved. The Deseret News, founded in 1850 in Salt Lake City, became the church's official organ and operated as such for decades, blending ecclesiastical instruction with civic news in a way that made the boundary between church and state effectively invisible in Utah territory. Young also established a culture of obedience in which public criticism of the leadership was treated not merely as dissent, but as apostasy, a spiritual crime with real social consequences, including excommunication, shunning, and in the territorial period, economic ruin. This infrastructure of narrative control survived the transition into the 20th century. When Fawn Mackay Brody, a young historian raised in a prominent Mormon family, published No Man Knows My History in 1945, the first serious academic biography of Joseph Smith, the church excommunicated her. The book drew heavily on primary sources, including many of the same documents and affidavits that had appeared in the Nauvoo Expositor a century earlier. The church's response was not to rebut the scholarship. It was to remove the scholar from the community and to warn members that reading the book was spiritually dangerous. The pattern repeated with the September 6 in 1993, when 6 Mormon intellectuals and feminists were excommunicated or disfellowshipped within the same month for publishing scholarship or opinions that challenged official church narratives. Among them was D. Michael Quinn, a former Brigham Young University professor whose research on the early practice of polygamy and on post-manifesto plural marriages had made him a target of institutional displeasure for years. Quinn's work was meticulous and based on church archives, to which he had been granted access as a trusted scholar. When his findings proved inconvenient, the institution did not address the evidence. It removed the person. The digital age brought new pressures and new methods of control. In 2008, the church launched its own suite of websites, including the official Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints site, Mormon.org, and later the Gospel Topics Essays, a series of carefully worded articles that acknowledged, for the first time in official church publications, certain historical facts that had been suppressed or denied for generations. Among these acknowledgements was the fact that Joseph Smith had practiced plural marriage with approximately 30 to 40 women, that some were already married, and that at least one was 14 years old. The essays were published quietly, without fanfare, and were not incorporated into the standard Sunday school curriculum for years. Many members discovered them only through ex-Mormon communities online. The Gospel Topics Essays represent perhaps the most revealing evolution in the church's relationship with information control. They exist not because the leadership decided that transparency was a moral imperative, but because the internet had made suppression impossible. The same information that William Law had published in the Nauvoo Expositor in 1844, the polygamy, the polyandry, the teenage brides, the secret ceremonies, was now available to anyone with a smartphone and a search engine. The church could no longer burn the press, so it did the next best thing. It published its own version of the story, framed in the most favorable possible light, and positioned it as the authoritative account. The strategy was not transparency. It was preemptive narrative management. And for millions of members over the age of 50, the Gospel Topics essays were a shock, precisely because they confirmed what the church had spent their entire lifetimes denying. These were people who had served missions, paid tithing, raised families in the church, and defended Joseph Smith in conversations with co-workers and neighbors, all while operating on a version of history that the church itself now admitted was incomplete. They had been told for decades that stories about plural marriage were anti-Mormon lies. Now the church's own website said otherwise. The betrayal was not that Joseph Smith had practiced polygamy. The betrayal was that the institution had known the truth and had chosen, deliberately and systematically, to hide it from the people who had given their lives to the cause. The Nauvoo Expositor existed for 3 days. It was published on June 7th, destroyed on June 10th, and by June 27th, the man who ordered its destruction was dead. In the official narrative of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Expositor is a footnote, a minor provocation by disgruntled apostates that led to the martyrdom of a prophet. The Church's curriculum materials, when they mention it at all, frame the episode as part of the persecution narrative, another example of the world's hostility toward God's chosen people. What they do not say, what they have never said in any manual or lesson or general conference talk, is that the people who published the Expositor were telling the truth. William Law was telling the truth about plural marriage. Austin Cowles was telling the truth about the secret revelation. The affidavits were accurate. The theology described in the Expositor, the plurality of gods, the eternal progression of man to godhood, the sealing of women to the prophet in secret ceremonies, all of it was real, all of it was happening, and Joseph Smith knew it was happening because he was the one doing it. The Expositor did not destroy Joseph Smith's reputation. It simply described it accurately, and that was intolerable. What happened on that June afternoon in 1844 was not an isolated act of poor judgment by a man under pressure. It was the purest expression of a principle that had been operating since the day Martin Harris mortgaged his farm to print the Book of Mormon. The principle is simple. The press exists to serve the institution. When it serves the institution, it is sacred. When it challenges the institution, it is a nuisance to be abated. That principle did not die with Joseph Smith in Carthage. It lived on in the excommunication of Fawn Brodie, in the purge of the September 6, in the quiet burial of the Gospel Topics essays at the bottom of a website that most members never visit. And it lives today in every conversation you have ever had with a family member or a bishop or a missionary who told you that your questions were dangerous, that your doubts were a sign of spiritual weakness, and that the only safe source of truth was the institution itself. The printing press has changed. The principle has not. In 1844, they smashed it with sledgehammers. Today, they do it with correlation committees, with intellectual property claims, with carefully managed digital content, and with a culture that teaches 12 million people that independent investigation is the first step toward apostasy. The Nauvoo Expositor told the truth for 3 days. It has taken 180 years for the rest of the world to catch up. And if you are hearing this story for the first time, if no Sunday school teacher, no seminary instructor, no mission president ever told you that Joseph Smith ordered the destruction of a newspaper that was exposing his secret marriages, then you already know everything you need to know about how this institution handles the truth. You already know because they did it to you.